you all have the minutes in front of you. I hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving. We're going to move right into bullet point 1, our call to order. We've got a few formalities that we need to take care of this morning. First, I just wanted to make an announcement that as permitted by the Governor's Disaster Declaration of November 13th, 2020, the determination has been made that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent for this committee to meet in person. To ensure a transparent and open meeting is possible, we will post the meeting materials approximately 1 week in advance. We'll provide a recording of this meeting linked on our website, and we'll take all votes by a roll call. A few other reminders is to please stay muted when not talking, and feel free to unmute yourself at any point if you want to contribute to the conversation. Keep your video on if you're comfortable doing so, but if you're not, that's certainly fine. You can also use the chat feature for any questions or comments you might have. Please be aware that this meeting, including all messages in the chat box, will be recorded in compliance with the Illinois Open Meeting Act. And for our guests and general public, we are very happy you could join us this morning, but we do ask that you please remain muted until the public comment section at the end of the meeting. Taking a look at agenda bullet point number 2 there, agenda changes and announcements. We do have a few of those as well this morning. First, I'd like to welcome 2 new committee members. First one is Raymond Drake, who is the Vice President of State and Government Affairs for UPS. Ray's also on the Illinois Trucking Association Board of Directors, so welcome, Ray. Happy to have you here. The second is Peter Wolf, the Director of Market Development for TTX. So Peter, thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to the committee. Bullet point 3, approval of minutes from our last meeting on September 21st, excuse me. We're going to do our approval of the minutes as I mentioned. We do have to do a roll call vote. We will use this roll call vote to approve the minutes and to also confirm attendance, which will save us time from redoing them. Committee members do not need to abstain from approving minutes from a previous meeting that you did not attend. And before we go have Ryan do a roll call, I need a motion to go ahead and approve the minutes. So do I have a motion?
Eric, all motion.
All right. I've got a motion from Herbert. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you very much. And Ryan, I'll turn it over to you to do the roll call.
Great, thank you. So just as a reminder, this is both for attendance and for approving the minutes from the last meeting. So we'll be doing this in alphabetical order. So I'll start with Joe Alonzo from CDOT.
Present, and approve of the minutes.
Elaine Bottomley from Council of Mayors.
Present and approving the minutes, yes.
Mike Burton from C&K Trucking. Sam Wright from Cook County.
Present and approve the minutes.
Libby Ogard, Prime Focus.
Colin Dusing from Will County.
Present and yes.
Eric, Illinois Trucking. Clark Carricker from Illinois Chamber.
That was impressive, Ryan. I am here and I approve of the minutes.
Kazuya Kawamura.
Yes, approve the minute.
Amy Lee.
Yes.
John Loper. And then Libby, you said you were here and approved?
Yes, thank you.
Adam Rod from CDA.
Here, yes.
Deanna Smith from IDOT.
Present and yes.
Herbert Smith.
Present and yes.
And finally, Peter Wolf with TXX or TTX. Welcome.
Thank you. Here.
Okay, that should be everybody.
All right, excellent. Bullet point number 4, approval of 2020 meeting schedule. I guess, Ryan, we'll turn it right back over to you.
Great, thank you. Let me advance the slide here. Okay. So the proposed dates that are listed here, I used a similar schedule that was used in 2020. It can be hard to find a schedule that works for everybody in a group this size, and balancing the times with other Cmap committees. So I want to make sure I offer a preemptive apology if any of these meeting times conflict with anyone's schedules. We do need a formal acceptance of this schedule. And again, with that, we'll need to entertain a motion to approve in a second. Then we can have some discussion and then do another roll call vote for this one.
So moved by Amy Lee.
Second, Elaine Bottomley.
Did anybody have any discussion for this item? Okay, so I'll just go through and do another. I apologize, I know this is kind of tedious, but we just want to make sure we're complying with the open records laws. So I'm just gonna go through again one more time and do a roll call vote for this. So Joe with CDOT.
I concur.
And Elaine Bottomley.
Yes.
Mike Burton, are you there? Okay, Sam Wright with Cook County.
Yes.
Colin Dusing.
Yes.
And Eric Gallion.
Yes.
Clark Carricker.
Yes.
Kazuya Kawamura.
Yes, I will miss the February 22nd meeting, like I posted in the chat, because the conflict with my teaching.
Okay, thank you. Amy.
Yes.
John Loper, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Yes.
Oh, great. Libby Ogard.
Yes.
Adam Rod.
Approved.
Deanna Smith.
Yes.
Herbert Smith, are you there?
Yes.
Eric Varela.
Yes.
And Peter Wolf.
Yes.
Great, thank you. That should be the last roll call vote we need to take today. So thank you for bearing with us on that.
All right. Ryan, are we good ahead to move into number 5 then, our climate agenda?
Yep, absolutely.
All right, so I'm going to turn it over at this time to presenters from Cmap, Nora Beck, Sarah Buckhorn, Russell Pitrioak, sorry if I bastardized that, Russell, and Martin Menninger.
Great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Nora Beck, and I'm a senior planner at Cmap. Following Onto 2050, Cmap identified climate mitigation and adaptation as a key area of work going forward for the agency. So this morning, I'm hoping to provide you with 3 things. A quick recap of our climate challenge and the Onto 2050 recommendations that are focused on climate mitigation and adaptation, an overview of Cmap's current resources for climate work, as well as the projects underway right now this year. And then I'll focus in on just one of our current projects, the development of a multi-year implementation plan for the agency's climate work. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to fill you in on 2 more projects. So with that, let's get started. Ryan, could you advance the slides? Is that? Okay, yep. Great, thanks. So using our greenhouse gas inventory, which tracks emissions in the region, Onto 2050 set a goal of reaching climate stabilization by the year 2050. This was set for a reduction of emissions by 80% of what they were in 1990 by the year 2050, as that was the best scientific guidance at the time. The needed decrease in emissions is pretty dramatic here. We need to get rid of at least 100 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. It's important to note that we may also need to revisit this goal in light of both evolving research as well as government inaction. So given the scale of this issue, Onto 2050 recommends that climate mitigation work cannot just happen within the region, though it needs to, but that we also need to comprehensively address energy and climate change at both the federal and the state levels. The next slide shows just where these emissions are coming from. Our 2015 greenhouse gas inventory presents the emissions by subsector, with the stationary energy source emissions in purple, transportation in green, and waste in blue. And you can see that the four largest subsectors are residential buildings, commercial and institutional buildings and facilities, manufacturing industries, and then on-road transportation emissions. Onto 2050 recommends strategies that focus on transforming our transportation systems to reduce emissions, and then increasing low and zero emissions energy generation, so addressing those stationary energy sources shown here in purple. In the next slide, we see that northeastern Illinois has already experienced and is projected to see even greater changes in temperature and precipitation from climate change. This can result in an increase in extreme heat, increases in flooding, reduced soil capacity from drought, and increases in winter rain and denser, heavier snow. This data is coming from the 2018 National Climate Assessment, and it shows the observed changes so far in temperature on the left. And in Illinois, we've seen average annual temperatures have increased by 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And then on the right, you can see some of the projected changes. So they have projected changes by mid-century and then late century. In the high emissions scenario, so on the right, you can see increases in temperature continue potentially up to 8 degrees by the end of the century. And as you may have heard recently in the news, we appear to be currently on track with a high emissions scenario. In the next slide, you can see that in addition to becoming warmer, the region's climate is becoming wetter and more variable. Again, this data is coming from the 2018 National Climate Assessment. It shows observed changes in temperature, in precipitation on the left. And in Illinois, you may have heard the state recently updated our data on rainfall patterns. We're seeing some pretty large changes with big implications for infrastructure and development design. Projected changes by late century are shown on the right under a high emissions scenario. And again, these are showing some pretty substantial increases in precipitation in the winter and the spring. And we're also seeing increases in the number and size of very large storms. So while the annual precipitation is steadily increasing, more of that rainfall is coming in singular events that overwhelm our infrastructure system. So there's a quick recap of what's happening. I did want to touch on our current climate resources. So in the next section, I'm going to talk about what we've created so far as Cmap has worked in the climate space. Ryan, if you could advance to maybe 2 slides now. Yeah, one more, thanks. So I'm not going to step through all of these resources, and I'm happy to connect you with any of these later if you'd like. But I did want to make sure you had a good sample of what our work has covered to date. In policy and guidance, we've produced several guides, strategy papers that present data, tools, and approaches to use. Most of these resources have focused on assisting local governments with adaptation efforts. For example, one of our most recent products, we partnered with the American Planning Association to develop a guide on how to incorporate climate science into local planning efforts. Similarly, we've provided planning assistance through our local technical assistance program to mostly help with resilience work, doing those climate vulnerability assessments, helping with stormwater, and then a couple of plans that have focused on mitigation. In the next slide, and you're well aware of this, Cmap programs transportation dollars, and these programs have historically focused on improvements in air quality and encouraging mode shift. A couple of things to note, Onto 2050's regionally significant project evaluation included criteria measuring reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And then most recently, our SDP shared fund now encourages the incorporation of green infrastructure, which can help us with our adaptation efforts. And then last but not least, in the next slide, Cmap is providing the region with data to assist in climate planning. So from that regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory that I was presenting on earlier, that helps us track our performance on mitigation efforts. But we also have other things like the Regional Flood Susceptibility Index, which identifies areas in the region that are more susceptible to flooding and can be used as a way to prioritize our work. So next slide, I wanted to fill you in on our current year's work plan items that relate to the climate challenge. These first 5 projects are part of our main focus area. And next slide, Ryan. Thanks. So I'll present on the climate multi-year implementation planning project in just a moment. And then my colleagues are going to talk about the next 2, transportation mitigation strategies, and then greenhouse gas reporting and performance monitoring. We also have a project on climate mitigation and adaptation technical assistance. This is really geared to make sure that when we do local technical assistance or capacity building work, we're incorporating those mitigation and adaptation strategies where possible. And then a climate data inventory and refinement. Here we're trying to understand what is the climate data that we have, what do we need, and how do we provide it to our stakeholders. And then in the next slide, we've got a couple more projects that will help us with implementation. The first one is a local technical assistance project with the Central Council of Mayors. They've asked us for help in developing a transportation vulnerability and resilience plan. And this plan will explore how can we understand where flooding is occurring and where it lines up with their capital improvement plan. We've also been having quarterly talks with the county stormwater management leaders, really focused in on what do we do with our current changes in precipitation as well as the projected values. We also have a project with the Metropolitan Mayors Caucus and the Global Covenant of Mayors to develop a Chicago Region Municipal Climate Action Plan. This project will help identify steps for local governments to reduce emissions as well as work on adaptation. And then last but not least, we're exploring the development of a heat susceptibility index. This is designed to help us figure out where we can prioritize our mitigation work to reduce heat island effect. All right, so in the last section of my presentation, I want to talk about the climate multi-year implementation plan. In the next slide, we've got our project purpose. It's to develop a work plan for the next 3 to 5 years that maps out a strategy for implementing climate-related ONTO 2050 recommendations. In order to do this, we need to understand the agency's role in this complex topic. We really need to nail down specific strategic projects where Cmap can really add value to the conversation. And then all of this work needs to integrate equity considerations. Our scope is fairly simple in the next slide. We've been meeting with our working committees like this meeting right now, but also talking one-on-one with stakeholders. We've looked at what other MPOs are doing across the nation in terms of both adaptation and mitigation work. And we're now in the phase of identifying and prioritizing a slate of projects that will then later assess and determine which ones are really where we can really make some substantial improvements and draft that multi-year plan. So I did want to share some of the ONTO 2050 strategies that we're focusing on. And in the next slide, you can see that we've really targeted a set of 6 strategies. There are a lot of climate mitigation and adaptation related strategies in ONTO 2050. And so we're exploring what activities within these different topic areas Cmap could complete and then help advance the work. And as we brainstorm potential paths forward, we recognize that we're going to have to make some hard decisions, right? There's just not enough time or staff in the day to work on all of these. So we'll be asking ourselves, and I'll ask you this today, what areas can Cmap make the most change? And we're also asking those questions, those but-for questions. So if Cmap doesn't work in an area, are there already partners that are taking this on? Or does it mean that that maybe there won't be as much action in a specific topic area? So with that, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions. In the next slide, we can take them in whatever order you'd like. So the first one, what areas of work present the best opportunities for Cmap to advance change? And within the freight umbrella, are there specific strategies that you think Cmap should be focusing on? And then the last but not least, how can Cmap assist or jumpstart implementation by other partners?
Well, I'll start off the conversation. This is
Great.
Colin Dusting with Will County. I've already heard this presentation from Nora from the Land Use Committee.
Yeah.
And I've already forwarded her some suggestions. One of which was to build a checklist of items that local governments can add to their building codes or their zoning codes in order to facilitate additional alternative energy type of scenarios available to them. Because if you looked at the pie chart, buildings were a big part of the problem, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the local governments that issue the building permits. So how can the local governments, through their codes, be able to make these changes? And it could be through the building code or the zoning code. It depends on what is important to them. But then also, because a large portion of that pie chart also included institutional buildings, it's schools. Schools are exempt from local building code. It is the State Board of Education that issues those permits. So Cmap, as the regional lobbying group for the Chicagoland region, could be the spokesperson for that change. And then, of course, Cmap's role as the MPO obviously makes them a key factor in the freight realm. So I'll start the discussion with that.
Thanks, Colin. Maybe we could get more into some of the specifics within freight. Are there strategies that you think Cmap should be focusing on here?
I think this is Joe Alonso calling from CDOT. And what I can indicate for this discussion is that for freight, we'd like to get as much data as possible broken down to the community or neighborhood level, if that is even possible. Because that's something that I think will be beneficial as we begin outreach in the near future, as we begin some of our initiatives that we're looking to do in certain areas of the city of Chicago. So I don't know whether or not you currently have it now or whether or not that's something that could be done in the future.
Just so I understand, what kind of data are you referring to?
We're looking at GHG type emissions. Okay. Because I know there's a dearth of data that we have currently.
Thanks, Joel.
This is Kazuya Kamara. I second Joe. And just thinking that what's the trade-off between people going to the stores to purchase goods versus goods getting delivered to their home? I think there have been some academic studies on that, but it's pretty complicated because it depends on what kind of vehicle fleet is out there at the particular location that people use, and what vehicles are used by the delivery companies. And so, it can be fairly location specific. Densities and those kind of things probably matters too. So to support that, I mean, we need a lot of data. And that I was just wondering, maybe this is more the topic one you discussed, was is there scoping plan about, if you follow the AB 32 in California, the airport, they had a scoping plan to budget all the cuts in the carbon emissions that's related to the particular policy. So, for example, in the transportation area, we knew that fuel economy standard is the most important component. That if that doesn't go, then the other things like TODs and those things they're pretty much futile in terms of meeting the transportation sector goals. So, that will really help us prioritize what we need to do and what we need to put, all the capital behind to reduce the carbon. So, just wondering, was there a scoping plan related to the amount? I've seen the first time that actual target for the region, and what you need to do to connect that to the particular policies to see if we can even achieve that, feasible or not.
Mm-hmm. Well, that really connects to one of the additional projects that we have underway this year. So I'm going to let Martin answer that question when we get to that point. Any other comments?
Hey, this is Amy from Tollway. I think something that would be really helpful for us is looking at things from an infrastructure programming standpoint. When we think about needing to update design standards for, say, a 50-year flood now becomes a 25-year flood, what is the cost of upgrading our infrastructure to increase resiliency, knowing that these significant rain events and things like that are going to happen more frequently? I think that would really help us sort of dial in on what is the cost of resiliency in light of these pending changes in climate.
Thanks, Amy. I think there are several different ways that we could tackle that. So we'll have to explore. Any other comments?
Yeah, this is Elaine Bodley with the Will County Governmental League representing Council of Mayors. I just wanted to add that I'm not sure if everyone's fully aware about how the STP shared fund was, set up and implemented. We're finishing up the first year of the shared fund. And then after the shared fund update, all of the regional councils had to update their STP local methodology. And a part of our STP local methodology required us to have 25% of our points be planning factors from Cmap. I know for the Will County Council and a bunch of the other ones, we directly copied the point breakdown that's used in the shared fund. So for Will County, I know one of the planning factors that I wanted to be sure to use was green infrastructure. So for our call for projects that we had this year, we had points that were dedicated towards green infrastructure. So I had personally just kind of copied what Cmap had done. So, having continued resources and assets that we could access through Cmap, I'd be willing to add or increase the stringency of my green infrastructure points if I had greater access to the resources to properly score them, and maybe even give my municipalities greater resources to help implement green infrastructure. So in my call for projects, I think we ended up getting like 18 projects that had applied, and all of them were committing to adding green infrastructure components, which I thought was huge. I think a lot of the PLs within the region could probably also share very similar stories. So.
Great, thanks, Elaine. Okay, well, this has been very helpful. Thank you. And if you have additional comments, I think my email is on the next slide. So happy to take them. And if you want access to any of CMAP's climate resources, please let me know. Thank you. And Martin, are you next, or is it Sarah and Russell?
I think it's Sarah and Russell.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. As you just heard, Cmap, and my name is Russell Petroviak, just introduced myself, and Sarah Buckhorn is the other, my colleague, who will be giving the bulk of the presentation. As you just heard, Cmap is looking at issues related to climate change and mitigation. In order to do this work effectively, we need to know where we're at. We need to establish a starting point for greenhouse gases as they relate to transportation, and more specifically on-road mobile sources, which is an area Cmap has more influence than other sectors that emit GHGs. Today's presentation will show where we are at today based on our current transportation system and land use patterns. It is meant to establish a starting point from which we can measure mitigation efforts over time. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to go through the presentation and give you the information related to where we're at now. Thank you. So Sarah, it's all yours.
All right. Thanks, Russell. We can go to the next slide. So as Russell mentioned, we want to look at transportation emissions because of our role in shaping regional transportation and because of the impact of transportation on our regional emissions. So as Nora already pointed out, transportation makes up a large portion of our overall emissions. In the 2015 greenhouse gas inventory, it was the second largest emission sector, and within transportation, on-road emissions specifically make up the majority of transportation emissions. So on-road emissions alone make up nearly 1/4 of all emissions. This presentation will focus exclusively on on-road emissions on the regional scale. So next slide. The on-road transportation emissions numbers in that inventory that I just mentioned, along with all of the numbers that you'll hear in this presentation, come from EPA's Motor Vehicle Emissions Simulator, or MOVES modeling system. So MOVES requires a variety of input files regarding vehicle population, climate, and vehicle activity. The MOVES inputs in green come from our trip-based travel demand model. And this model has its own set of inputs, including socioeconomic data and regional highway and transit networks. We update all of these inputs regularly to reflect new regional projects, shifts in demographics, and shifts in travel behavior. So the MOVES model reflects all fuel economy standards finalized as of the model release date. So right now, what you see in this presentation is still from MOVES 2014A. So that incorporates the light duty greenhouse gas emission standards and the heavy duty greenhouse gas phase 1 emission standards. We are going to be working on transitioning to MOVES 3, which will incorporate a few additional standards, including the heavy duty greenhouse gas phase 2 rule. And we're required to run MOVES to determine if our long-range regional transportation plan or transportation improvement program conforms to applicable emissions budgets for particulate matter and ozone precursors before it is approved. So this is our semi-annual conformity analysis. But as part of that process, we also gather information on greenhouse gas emissions. So the following slides will explore the results of these conformity analyses for previous conformity runs. So jumping into the data, next slide. This is results from our spring 2020 conformity run. So we're looking at regional greenhouse gas emissions over time. And we can see that over time, modeled greenhouse gas emissions decreased through 2040, then increased slightly for a total of 24.2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2050. This is a 16% decrease from the 2015 greenhouse gas inventory value. So recall that this is essentially our baseline scenario. It's showing us what regional emissions will look like with our planned transportation improvements, current travel model assumptions, and the regulations captured in MOVES. We're focusing on this baseline data today to better understand it before using it as a starting point for modeling mitigation strategies. One thing that stands out in this slide is the increase from 2040 to 2050. So one factor in this is that virtually all of the fiscally constrained projects in our current long-range transportation plan have a completion year of 2040 or sooner. So very little capacity is added to the roadway network after 2040, but VMT continues to increase from 2040 to 2050. So we're introducing more congestion into the system and thus more idling, acceleration and deceleration events, and traveling at suboptimal speeds. So that's one explanation for why we see emissions increase in this model. All right, next slide. So that data you just saw was for a recent conformity run. But one thing we can look at with our historical data is how results have varied across previous conformity runs. So we have data from conformity runs from 2016 to 2020. And runs in these years spanned across two comprehensive plan setups, go to 2040 and on to 2050. So from one semi-annual run to the next, we typically don't see large changes in results, since few planned projects have a large regional impact, but with a plan update comes updates to many of the model inputs. So in the next slides, we'll look at results grouped together by plan. So here, we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions by year for conformity runs grouped by plan. So the go to 2040 runs are in blue and the on to 2050 runs are in red. So we can see that emissions results are actually mostly consistent between plans, even though on to 2050 focus more on infill development and transit ridership. And we can see that difference in development and mode choice patterns if we compare the annual vehicle miles traveled for conformity runs grouped by plan, which we'll do in the next slide. So here we're looking at system-wide vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, and we see that total VMT is higher for the Go to 2040 runs. So this underscores that VMT is just one factor driving greenhouse gas emissions, and it's not the only explanatory variable. Because in this example, although VMT is higher for the Go to 2040 runs, we saw that the emissions results are actually mostly consistent between the planned setups. So this means that there were other changes that caused a small increase in CO2e per mile and on to 2050. One of them being an increase in the percentage of total VMT that came from trucks as opposed to passenger vehicles. So next slide. We just alluded to the importance of different vehicle or source types when analyzing emissions. So let's spend more time considering how different source types contribute to total emissions for the most recent conformity run. But first, we'll review the different categories of source types that we'll talk about. Next slide. So this is just some definitions that I will familiarize you with. So passenger cars are sedans, coupes, compacts, and station wagons with the primary purpose of carrying passengers. Trucks are pickups, SUVs, and vans to carry passengers. Then we have our combination and single unit long haul trucks. So those are trucks with a primary trip length of over 200 miles. Combination being a truck tractor towing at least one trailer. Single unit being trucks with a vehicle rating greater than 10,000 pounds or a dually. And then everything else, for the purposes of this presentation, we're grouping into an other category. So that includes things like light commercial trucks, motorcycles, short haul trucks, transit buses, school buses, motorhomes, and refuse trucks. Okay, so next slide. So here we are looking at the percent of total on-road emissions that comes from each source type listed in the legend. So recall that overall emissions are going down over the years, but with this 100% stacked bar chart, we can see how the composition of those emissions by source varies over time. So looking at this data, we can see that over the model years, the portion of total emissions from cars and trucks in the blue and red decreases, and the portion of emissions from combination long-haul trucks and single-unit long-haul trucks in the orange and green increases. So we can pull in the VMT information in the bottom chart to help us interpret this. The VMT split by source year stays relatively consistent over time, so this bar represents an average year. As you can see, the majority of regional VMT also comes from passenger cars and trucks, while combination long-haul trucks have outsized emissions for their VMT contributions, which reflects their different emissions profiles. Next slide. We can also look at how emissions are spread across different facility or road types. Next slide. So as you might expect, the majority of emissions in our region are from urban roads, which are in the dark and light blue. And restricted and unrestricted. Unrestricted refers to arterial streets and local roads, while restricted refers to your freeways, freeway ramps, expressways, and toll roads. So as with the source type analysis here, we've added VMT information on the bottom. So although urban restricted roads, which are again the freeways and expressways in light blue, have less VMT on them than the urban unrestricted roads, they're actually the sites of a large amount of emissions still, which likely points to the fact that most truck travel occurs on these roads. And just note that there's no VMT from off-network facility types in green, because that refers to processes that generate emissions but are not associated with being on a road. So things like starts, emissions from parked vehicles, and extended idling by heavy-duty trucks. All right, next slide. So far we've just been looking at annual totals. So we can also break down at different timescales to look at monthly, daily, and hourly emissions. So our travel model, which you'll recall provides us with a lot of the moves inputs, that produces results for an average weekday. So to look at these finer timescales, we have to use vehicle count data from IDOT to scale the data appropriately. And just keep in mind that as we break the data into finer pieces, the uncertainty around each data point grows. All right, so next slide. To start with month, here we're looking at 2050 emissions by month by source type for the last conformity run. So a few things stand out here. Combination long-haul truck emissions in orange peak in August through November, which is also the time of year with the most long-haul truck VMT. Passenger car emissions in light blue peak in May through July, which is also the time of year with the most passenger car VMT. And aside from changes in activity, another factor in monthly emission changes is the weather. Depending on the pollutant, there can be an increase in emissions at low temperatures associated with cold starts and or at high temperatures associated with AC usage. Next slide. So now, next level of detail looking at day type. There are two day types in the model, weekday and weekend. So first, comparing total emissions for these day types, weekend emissions are 38.5% lower than weekday emissions. Moving to the graph to the right, looking at the percent total emissions for a 2050 July day by source type for each day type, we see that trucks in the green and orange make up a reduced portions of daily emissions on the weekend. Trucks also have a greater reduction in weekend VMT than passenger vehicles. So truck weekend VMT is down 62% compared to their weekday values, whereas passenger vehicle VMT decreases 26% on the weekend. Next slide. And finally, looking at the hourly scale. So here we're looking at emissions by source by hour for a July weekday in 2050. We can see that passenger vehicle emissions peak during the AM and PM peak travel periods, which are shaded in light gray. And so these are, of course, the periods with more travel and more VMT. Trucks keep emission production high between the peak periods and have higher emissions outputs than other sources during the overnight periods. Next slide. And finally, as mentioned earlier, MOVES can support analysis for a number of different pollutants. And so we also gathered we can gather background data and conduct similar analysis on any of these. So in the next slide, we'll do just a basic quick glance at some of these other pollutants. So here's one way to look at data for them. We're looking at percent total emissions for these various pollutants by source type for a 2050 July weekday. In this slide, passenger vehicles and long-haul trucks have been grouped together in the light blue and orange, respectively, for a simpler view. The takeaway here is that each pollutant has a different emission source composition. So it's not always, oh, it's mostly trucks or, oh, it's mostly passenger vehicles. It actually depends on the pollutant we're talking about. Trucks are major sources of methane, nitrous oxides, and exhaust particulate matter, while passenger vehicles are the top sources of brake and tire particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, and nitrous oxide. CO2e, which is what we've been looking at in every other slide in this presentation, is shown here for reference. And the individual greenhouse gases that are part of that CO2e measurement, aside from CO2, are here and labeled with the greenhouse gas tag. So again, the point of this slide is that we need broad strategies if we want to tackle multiple emissions, since there isn't a one size fits all strategy. And next slide. So now that we've characterized our current emissions projections, how does that compare with where we want to be? So here we have the same data in red that you saw in the very first slide that I presented, which are, again, the total on-road emissions from our last conformity run. And now we've added our draft on-road emissions target in the blue dashed line. So note that this isn't our official target, but it's a starting point for the conversation for how the transportation sector should contribute to achieving our regional target, which Nora mentioned at the beginning of her presentation. And as you can see, there is a gap that grows over time. So we need some targeted mitigation strategies to achieve our goal. Next slide. And so this characterization of our baseline is really just the first step. We want to work on refining our transportation sector emissions target, so that target in blue that you saw, we want to work with the Transportation Mitigation Strategies project, which you'll hear about next, to actually start to model some mitigation strategies. We also want to take our time to transition to Moves 3, which will help us and our model incorporate current regulations and other improvements that have come online since the last Moves model. And we also, one of you commented earlier, you'd love to see some emissions data at a finer geographic scale. So we're hoping to look at emissions data on different geographic scales and see what's possible there. And that is it for telling you about this baseline data. But if you have any questions, Russell and I are here.
I do have one question about the passenger vehicle emissions. Is it assuming just the regulatory emissions drops, or does that also include an increased market of electric vehicles becoming more and more popular over time?
Yeah, as far as I know, and Russell, correct me if I'm wrong, it's basically only the regulated improvements in fuel efficiency. It's not actually changing the portion of EVs over time, but that is something that we might model as part of the mitigation strategies project. But in our official results, EV adoption isn't part of the reduction.
Yes, yeah, this is based on where things are today. So the next presentation will cover ways that we can look at the future. But where we are today, EV is extremely small percentage of the market. So we can't show that in this kind of modeling. That would be more for the next presentation when we look at different strategies. I did want to address John's question too that he put in the chat. When we look at, I know Jason kind of answered it, but when we look at stuff from prior years, the reason that we are only showing baseline stuff from 2016 and forward, I think it's 2016 is when we started, or 2014, I could be wrong. It has to do with the modeling. So we had different models and we had different assumptions back then. So we try to backcast. It might cause us not to be quite as certain as maybe the numbers would suggest. So what we have here is what we think are good starting points. We use the same modeling for 2014. I mean, not 2014, for ON2 2040, as we do for GO2 2050. Sorry, I got reversed. But anyway, there are two long-range plans. We've used the same models, and so that gives us comparable results. And that's kind of as comfortable as we are with going back and looking at stuff from a modeling standpoint. We can always produce estimates from previous stuff, but those are, they don't have the same level of certainty is what you're seeing in this presentation.
This is Amy. Would you also say that your baseline assumes current modal splits, say for transit and for rail versus roadway freight, things like that?
This was done prior to COVID, and so this assumes basically if we went back to, you know, this time last year, those conditions. So it was, you know, reflected in what we would say were real world conditions prior to COVID.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
If not, then we will hand it over to Martin to tell you more about some of the mitigation strategies that we might look at.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you, Sarah and Russell. So this project we're calling our Transportation Climate Mitigation Strategies. This is really, I guess, we do a lot of modeling at Cmap. This is another modeling project we're undertaking in the climate area. If you want to go to the next slide. And Nora and Sarah and Russell already talked about this a little bit, but again, there's a lot of different things that impact greenhouse gas emissions. This project specifically focuses on transportation, where Cmap plays a big role. But we don't forget that even if we electrify the entire transportation network, some of the power for that electric comes from somewhere else and is in a different bucket. So we want to acknowledge that and not ignore that. There's a lot of work to do across the spectrum. So next slide. This project is really a way for us to learn at the end of the day, using models and just exploring different pathways for mitigation in the transportation sector. We want to increase Cmap staff understanding and our partners' understanding of different transportation decisions. One reason we want to do this is we are seeing legislation across the country, around the world, that's being placed on transportation. We want to both anticipate legislation that could come and potentially influence it, be part of that conversation at the state, local, or even national level. And the way we're going to do this is just sort of a high-level quantification of different strategies. So we know from our literature review and just it makes sense that no one strategy is the right answer. We're not going to come to the end of this project and say the answer is to follow this strategy. The answer is almost certainly going to be we should pursue many or all of the strategies. But we want to sort of know the relative impact of different strategies that could be pursued. Next slide. So where are we at? We've done sort of a literature review. We've identified a lot of different strategies. We had a very long list, and we've sort of condensed that into things that can be modeled or aligned with Cmap's past policies and recommendations. We're sort of at the tail end of this orange block section in the middle where we're selecting strategies to model. The door's not completely closed. We're open to new ideas, but we've sort of got a list that we're starting to work our way through. Once we model those strategies, and I'll talk about our modeling a little bit later, and also talk about the strategies that we're thinking about later. Once we've sort of worked through those models, we want to connect sort of our modeling work to our policy work. So is there something we can do different with STP? I think somebody mentioned. Is there a way we can work it into some of the other funds that we program, or our LTA work, or our policy work? What do we sort of do once we have a good understanding of how to move the needle on greenhouse gas emissions? Next slide. So we've done 2 projects like this recently, very similar in a sense. On the left is sorry about the font being small. On the left is a chart out of our transit ridership growth study. And on the right is a chart out of our congestion study. So what we did is we went out and did a literature review and found sort of the high and low for scenarios. So how much, for example, could gas tax be increased? Well, maybe we could increase it to European levels, or maybe we could just increase it enough to sort of fund ongoing operations, or find the high and the low and model both of them. So you'll see in these charts the high and the low impact on transit ridership and the high and the low impact on congestion. For this project, we're going to sort of look at the high and low scenarios and their impact on emissions. So just to put a little context, and from these studies, we're borrowing a lot of scenarios that we've run in the past that sort of reflect Cmap recommendations and things that have been recommended in plans. Next slide. So to sort of get you thinking about what we're going to do in this project, I have this very simplistic diagram of our modeling process. So there are two models, and Sarah already talked about these a little. We have our trip-based model, which looks at travel behavior, and the EPA moves model, which converts that travel behavior into emissions. So we bring in population, employment, forecasts, look at the transportation network so we can adjust the frequency of buses or how many lanes are on a road, how much tolls are. We can adjust all these different parameters and feed them into our trip-based model. And then in the moves model, we have the ability to adjust things like the fleet profile. So somebody asked earlier about electrification. So we can sort of input different levels of electrification or potentially even other fuel types and how quickly we get to those vehicle mixes, and then understand how that would impact our emissions for different vehicles and different user groups and things like that. Next slide. So these are the scenarios that we've sort of got right now that we're working through. Things like RSPs here are regionally significant projects. So think projects that transportation projects CMAQ has recommended to build in the region. How do those impact emissions? How does transit use impact emissions? The price of driving and things like that. Now, one thing we've sort of noticed as we develop this scenario list is we've got a lot of different strategies to impact how people use their personal vehicles and try to incentivize them to consolidate trips or switch to transit. We have many fewer strategies on how to influence freight and trucks. And as Sarah talked about, freight and trucks make a big share of emissions. So we're sort of doing a little more literature review to try to figure out if there are additional strategies we haven't considered. But we're definitely interested on feedback from this committee if there is something we should be looking at, freight strategies that we haven't considered other than just sort of making them more efficient or electrification, things like that. Out of scope and maybe for the future is looking at things like land use. Our model doesn't consider air and marine emissions. And then things like how roads are constructed and the manufacture of vehicles and things like that are sort of out of scope right now, but we acknowledge are important things. Go to the next slide. So my first question here sort of repeats a question Nora had. What sort of policies should we be looking at? And then I would also like to know, so what would you like to know? What information would you like to bring back to your boss, or do you think would really make an impact on legislators if you had it? What type of information do you need to bring to others? And then what policies do you think we should be pursuing, and what information do you need to support those efforts? So with that, I'll stop talking for a minute. I don't see any new questions in the chat, but see if you have any comments.
Martin, right, this is Kazuya. Hello.
Hello, Kazuya.
Hi. A question about the model, the trip-based model. From the information presented, I presume that is a full-step model that they used for the 2050, right? So how do you feel about from the freight specific issues, especially the last mile, the urban freight, which is mostly done by the tour of the vehicles, when they leave the DCs and they make deliveries and come back, there's a tour. And full step model, as you know, is not built to simulate, capture those kind of behavior. And also, when you implement a policy like consolidation of deliveries and stuff, it's probably not capable of really capturing, effect of those policies, I'm afraid. How do you feel about, does the freight analysis require a different kind of model, maybe that micro simulation, activity-based one that you already have some of that, and also I know the Argonne and the UIC partnership have been building those things over the years. Are you looking at using those more advanced, sophisticated models?
We haven't talked about that. I agree with you that there are some limitations on our freight abilities in the 4-step model. It does give us sort of the right outputs to feed into moves. But I think that's an interesting idea to sort of look elsewhere at for freight modeling capabilities to sort of supplement or also inform this work.
Yeah.
But I will say that freight is sort of impacted by congestion and other things on the road. So there is some value to the 4-step model and the outputs that are in there.
Yeah, I agree with long haul. And I think you're very careful about, that saying it's long haul trips. And I really impressed by the accuracy and the, openness, transparency of the representation of everything you're doing, the quantifying everything. It's just the right approach. It's just, tools part is in the freight. It's just so difficult to model the freight behavior, which is very different from the passenger trips and the long haul truck trips. So I'm just saying that maybe resources may be needed for that, possibly. Whether you can look at the tools developed by the other groups within the Cmap or the outside groups.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on the our commercial modeling. Sarah chimed in. She works a little more closely and says we're working to improve that model right now with a consultant. So appreciate that input, Sarah. Sure. Any other thoughts?
Hi, this is Joe.
Amy with the tollway. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Amy, you can go ahead.
Okay, I'll just be really quick, just piggybacking off of Kazuya. There are certainly some limitations here if we're just talking about the traditional 4-step model. And so, the policy of prioritizing major freight bottlenecks on our system is still going to be pretty key there. But there is a lot of idling. There's a lot of sort of staging of trucks that aren't captured in the 4-step model that we could think better about developing strategies or policies around if there was a little more insight to that. So I kind of second Kazuya's prompting to think about more sophisticated modeling.
Yeah, thanks. Idling was something we had sort of discussed, and it was sort of on the edge if we were going to include it or not. We'll go back and take another look at that. I think you're right that it is a policy kind of thing that potentially we could weigh in on. So.
Hey, looking at the questions you posed in the slide here that you have on the screen, everybody speaks about the electrification of trucks, and the difficulty with that is that you don't have that many manufacturers that actually manufacture electrified trucks. And on top of that, even if they did, what you need to do is then we have the challenge of trying to incentivize the trucking firms in going that route because of the fact that it wouldn't be cost effective for their business to actually go and electrify their whole fleet, because of the fact that it's just gonna run them out of business, become bankrupt. It's just not gonna help the bottom line. So I think the strategy is trying to figure out a way to incentivizing, whether it be through a loan program or some type of buyback program that would help these trucking firms, and convincing them that it's a better option for them than what they currently have.
Definitely, yeah, and it's sort of a weakness of the models in that we can't specify exactly what those incentives would look like. We just sort of in modeling world have to say certain percentage of the fleet is electrified, and your methodology for getting there, whether it's a tax incentive or carbon pricing or some other method, I think is sort of the last step in this process. And like knowing that we need to get to this point, what are some different strategies that Cmap and our partners can pursue to actually get to where we need to be. So. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. I'm sure we'll be talking to you again sometime in the next year. Appreciate all the feedback.
All right. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to agenda point number 6, which is the 2021 call for transportation projects. Our presenters for this are Kama Dobbs and Doug Ferguson. So Kama or Doug, I will transfer it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kama Dobbs, a Senior Program Analyst in the Research Analysis and Programming Department. Today, I and my colleague Doug will be giving a quick background on programming of federal funds for freight-related projects in the CMAQ and STP Shared Fund programs. Ryan, if you could go to the next slide. We'll be highlighting eligible projects, how those are scored, past successful applications, and then wrapping up with information about our upcoming calls for projects. Next. As the Metropolitan Planning Organization for Northeast Illinois, CMAP is responsible for allocating certain federal funds directly to local transportation projects. CMAP solicits applications from local governments, highway and transit agencies, for all phases of highway, transit, and bike ped maintenance, modernization, and expansion projects, and apply scoring methodologies developed by our project selection committees to recommend programs of projects for funding. Next. The scoring methodologies and program development are largely driven by federal requirements and the 3 principles of ON to 2050, which are inclusive growth, resilience, and prioritized investment. Next. We program for 5 years at a time and can't program any more in a single year than is reasonably expected to be available in that year. We solicit project applications through calls for projects every 2 years, with the goal of each call being to program the 4th and 5th years of the program, as well as fill in projects in earlier years where funds may have come available due to other project delays or more precise estimates of available funds. So our next call for projects is scheduled to begin in January of 2021. So if you'll go next, I'm going to kick off today by focusing on our newest program, the STP Shared Fund. And when I'm done, I'll turn that presentation over to my colleague Doug to talk about the CMAQ program. Next, within the STP Shared Fund, for the out years that we'll be programming, there's approximately $25 million available in each of those years for regional projects, which includes road, bridge, safety, bike ped, transit, and of most interest today, truck route improvements and highway rail grade crossing improvements. Projects are evaluated on their readiness, their transportation impact, planning factors, as well as sub-regional priority, and are programmed by our STP Project Selection Committee. Next, to be eligible for the shared fund, projects must have a total cost for all of the project phases from engineering through construction of at least $5 million. Projects that cost less than $5 million can be funded if they're a partnership between 3 or more agencies. Preliminary, or what's known as phase 1, engineering needs to be substantially complete prior to applying for funding, and projects need to be included in an adopted local or regional plan, such as a municipal comprehensive plan, or germane to today, a local or regional freight or truck routing plan would qualify. Next slide. Some other basic requirements are that the project sponsor must be a unit of government, which is generally defined as a body that can levy taxes. This includes park and forest preserve districts. Non-municipal sponsors are eligible, but they are strongly encouraged to partner with a municipality. Partnerships with private entities are also encouraged. However, the lead agency implementing the project needs to be a government agency. A minimum of 20% of the cost of each phase of the project needs to be provided by the project sponsor using some sort of non-federal funds, which could be motor fuel tax, Rebuild Illinois bond funds, or other funds secured through partnerships with the county, the state, or private entities. And finally, because these are federal funds administered through IDOT, the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act, or GATA, applies to these projects. On to the next slide. The overall scoring matrix for the STP Shared Fund looks like this. A little complicated and scary, but the four main categories I mentioned earlier, readiness, transportation impact, planning factors, and sub-regional priority are shaded here, and then the criteria that make up those categories are also shown. Today I'm going to talk mostly about the existing conditions and improvement scoring that are part of transportation impact, as well as talking about the freight planning factor. But when I conclude the presentation, I'll put a link to the full application booklet, which is still in draft format, into the chat, so that if you want to dig into the details of the scoring, you can do so. So moving on to the next slide, what freight-related projects are eligible for the shared fund? The first project type is truck route improvement projects. And these are projects that will address inadequate geometries or pavement structural deficiencies, or projects that remove barriers to efficient truck movement. Some example projects could be roadway or intersection reconstruction, signal modifications, or even improvements that would relocate a designated truck route to a different corridor. Next, in our first call for projects in 2019, the extension of 143rd Street in Plainfield was our second highest ranked project overall, and received a little over $17 million in funding for right-of-way and construction to supplement the National Highway Freight Program funding that had already been awarded to the project by IDOT. So that's an example of a successful project. Moving on to the scoring itself, the existing condition score for truck route improvement projects includes 5 factors, which are shown on the table on this slide. Pavement condition, mobility, reliability, and truck volume scores get calculated on length-weighted averages. Safety points are based on the most critical segment or intersection within the project location. And then additional points are awarded if there are geometric deficiencies within the project corridor. And these together account for 20% of the project's total score. Next is the improvement portion of the score, which is also 20% of the total score. And this measures the cost effectiveness of improvements to mobility or geometric deficiencies, as well as the addition of systematic improvements such as truck travel information systems, adaptive signal control, signal interconnects, or even truck route signing. And finally, the mitigation of the negative impacts of trucks, such as rerouting trucks away from sensitive land uses, including noise mitigation in the project, or providing off-street freight loading and unloading zones are a few of the categories for that mitigation that can earn points. The next shared fund project category that benefits freight is highway rail crossing improvement projects. Next, the purpose of this category is to implement improvements at priority grade crossings identified throughout the region. While the primary focus of the category is grade separations, other improvements to at-grade crossings are also eligible. In our first call for projects, move on, next please. Funds were programmed for these 3 grade separation projects. Within the village of Barrington, funds to complete phase 2 engineering and right-of-way were awarded, as well as nearly $38 million for construction of this grade separation. This project was actually the highest scoring project within that last call for projects. We also awarded funding for Burnham and Dalton to complete phase 1 engineering for Burnham Avenue and Cottage Grove Avenue grade separations as well. So digging into the scoring, 75% of the existing condition scores for these grade crossing projects comes from the crossings ranking in the priority grade crossings report. And then 5 additional points are awarded if the crossing is one of those identified as a priority crossing location in that report. Next, we can see that, like all other project categories in the shared fund, the improvement score is based on the cost effectiveness of the improvement that the project makes. For grade crossing projects, the improvements to both the delay and safety components of the grade crossing prioritization score determine the score for the project. Next, please. So in addition to scoring projects for their transportation impact, the shared fund also considers a series of planning factors, which are directly tied to the priorities in ONTO 2050. One of those planning factors that Nora mentioned during the prior agenda item is green infrastructure, and then another is the freight planning factor. So as we can see on the next slide, accommodating freight can be part of any other eligible project type in the shared fund, even if improving freight movement isn't the main focus of the project. Activities like pavement improvements, geometry improvements, signals and signs, and other scope elements that support freight can be funded as part of any eligible project. And then specifically bridge projects, safety projects, and road expansion and reconstruction project types receive specific points for being part of a regional freight network or being located in a jurisdiction with freight supportive policies or procedures, including but not limited to things like online truck permitting programs, delivery management policies, or if the jurisdiction has participated in a truck routing study, completed a review of truck restrictions, or has identified the project in a freight mobility plan. So on to the next slide. The second fund source that we'll talk about today for freight-related projects is the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program, which is managed by my colleague Doug Ferguson. So I'm going to stop my babbling and turn it over to him.
Thank you, Kama. The Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program has been around in our region since 1992. The region receives these federal funds because we are in non-attainment for federal air quality standards for ozone. The program funds several types of projects, including transit improvements and bicycle facilities. But the two project types that I'll focus on today that are relevant to freight are the traffic flow improvement projects and the direct emissions reduction projects. The Cmap Project Selection Committee oversees the process and develops the program of projects that are put forth for selection. To be considered, next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I go back one slide, Ryan, if you wouldn't mind. To be considered as a potential Cmap project, it must have, the project itself must have a demonstrated air quality benefit. So Cmap staff is responsible for estimating the potential emissions reduction resulting from a project, but we cannot fund projects that don't demonstrate an emissions reduction. Next slide. All projects must provide that benefit within our non-attainment area, which includes the 7 counties of northeastern Illinois. And similar to the STP shared fund, preliminary phase 1 engineering must be completed in advance of programming. Next slide. Also similar to the STP shared fund, a potential project must have a public sponsor. But we do encourage for-profit and not-for-profit organizations that can partner with the public agency to submit an application. The match federal funding participation is capped at 80% of the eligible project expenses, and it is often the case with for-profit applications that the project selection committee looks to fund applications at a reduced percentage, sometimes in the range of like 65%, but it's handled on a case-by-case basis. All funded applications must follow the state of Illinois' GATA process, which is another hurdle to the process. Next slide, please. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the scoring of projects, but the simple breakdown is 60% comes from the cost benefit of emissions reduction, 30% from the transportation impact scores, and 10% for the inclusive growth. For the traffic flow improvement projects, the transportation impact criteria is looked at in 3 different areas: reliability, safety, and corridor transit improvements. For the direct emissions, it's benefits for sensitive populations makes up the majority of the score, but also there's 5 points for improving of public fleets. Next slide, please. So spending a little bit of time on the what we consider a traffic flow improvement for CMAC. There's 3 different types of projects. Next slide. Bottleneck eliminations, intersection improvements, and signal interconnects are the 3 different areas that we look for in traffic flow improvements. Per federal guidance, CMAC funds cannot be used for the addition of single occupancy vehicle lanes. So what that boils down to is no ad lane projects can be funded with CMAC. Next slide, sorry. Some examples of the projects that we funded in this are things like under the bottleneck elimination category, our highway rail grade separations. This is a photograph of the Grand Avenue grade separation in Franklin Park, which received some of its funding from the CMAC program. Next slide. But we've also done some other innovative ones. This is the I-294 Illinois 64 North Avenue interchange improvement project. This received partial funding through the CMAC program. And really what this one was focused on was removing out of direction travel in the area south of O'Hare in the North Park and Elmhurst region. I would add that this one's currently under construction and not complete yet, but a good portion of the emissions that was in the out of travel was caused by trucks. Next slide. On the direct emissions reduction side, we're really focused on vehicle and fuel technology. Next slide. And you can see here there's several different types of areas that we look at in here, but really what it boils down to is implementing cleaner fuels and cleaner vehicles. Next slide. For the freight and CMAC program, or for freight in the CMAC program in the last 10 years, the primary focus has been cleaning up rail yard operations. So we've funded several replacement and retrofit switcher locomotive projects. Some of them have also been short haul locomotives that have been replaced in the region. Here's just one example of one of the locomotives that was funded with CMAC for the Norfolk Southern at their 59th Street yard. But we've worked with, I think, almost all of the major rail operations in the region with projects in this area. Next slide. Direct emissions reductions haven't only involved rail operations. We've also funded projects like the City of Chicago's Drive Clean Truck program, which provided rebates on the purchase of electric and electric hybrid trucks. Here's just one example of a rebate that was done for the Rosen Baking Company in Chicago. But they haven't also been just kind of like traditional freight projects. Next slide. We've also done a project with Homewood Disposal where we retrofitted their refuse haulers with CNG and provided the building out of the fuel technology that they needed to keep those vehicles moving. So these are just some of the examples of past projects that we've done. There are others that are potentially possible that just haven't been thought of yet. If someone is thinking about a project, especially in the direct emissions reduction area, feel free to reach out to Cmap staff or the Council of Mayors Planning Liaisons with questions on these. Just providing some of the few examples, we can't even touch upon a lot of the different areas. So as Kama mentioned, next slide, please. The upcoming call for projects is opening on January 8th. And if we go to the next slide, Here's a basic timeline for the call for projects. So projects open up on January 8th. 2 months later, on March 5th, applications are due. At that point in time, staff will start the evaluation process with draft scores of projects available in the June timeframe. And then a draft program will be developed in July. At that point in time, the draft programs will go out for public comment. Public comments will be addressed by the different project selection committees. And then we expect final approval of the program in October by the MPO and Cmap board. I would add that in addition to CAMA posting the link to the STP application booklet, we are there. If you go to the next slide, 2 slides, I posted the web address for the call for projects. Currently, that's not updated for the upcoming call. It's still got information from the last call in 2019, but a lot of that information is the same and can be useful for our applicants considering submitting projects as they work to put that applications together. All that information will be updated prior to the call. I would add that in January, we will host 2 webinars. We're still working on the dates for those. That'll provide information not only on the 3 different programs that are part of the call for projects, but also how to submit an application and what materials are needed. So with that, I think Cam and I would be more than willing to answer any questions that that people might have. All right. Like I said, if you do come up with any questions, feel free to reach out to Cam or I over the next month or so. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Doug. And Ryan, with that, I believe I'm going to turn it back over to you for the 2021 committee work plan and member updates. So Ryan.
Great, thank you. So since our last meeting, I've heard from several members about ideas for topics that they'd like to see included in the committee's 2021 work plan. So Cmap does have a busy year plan for 2021, which will include work relating to the plan update of Onto 2050. I've included some examples of potential topics for the 2021 Freight Committee work plan on the next slide. But before we dive into that, I just thought it would be a good idea to provide a quick refresher on the committee's charge. So the Freight Committee's charge is to identify, assess, and respond to goods movement travel issues and opportunities and provide overall guidance for the development and implementation of the goods movement component of the region's comprehensive plan. Examples of key issues include safety, congestion relief, air quality, economic development, and community impacts. So on this slide shows some examples of potential topics. I'm not going to go through each of them, but I do want to point out one topic in particular. I've included a legislative update and a presentation of Cmap's federal and state legislative agenda, which will likely be included on February's agenda. I'm sure you all are aware a big event took place on November 3rd. And now with the election over, Cmap is reaching out to all of our new federal, state, and local representatives to make sure they're aware of the resources Cmap can provide to help them be more successful in their roles. In October, Congress passed and the president signed a continuing resolution that provides a 1-year extension of the FAST Act through September 2021. Also, as you all are probably aware, Congress and the administration have until December 11th, which is this week, to pass legislation keeping the federal government funded and open. As you can see, there are a lot of moving pieces right now, so my plan is to include an item on the February agenda to have Cmap staff provide that federal and state legislative update. By that point, we'll be past the inauguration. We should have, an approved cabinet. The runoff elections in Georgia will have occurred, and we'll have seen how things have shaken out at the State House. But turning our attention back to this slide, I've listed just a few of the many other topics that will likely be included in the committee's work plan. There isn't anything for the committee to approve for this agenda item. It's just meant to be an opportunity for discussion and provide committee members the opportunity to share updates you may have with the group, as well as any topics you'd like to propose to be included in the work plan for 2021. So my plan for this agenda item is, if it's all right with all of you, is just to go down our committee roster in alphabetical order and provide each of you an opportunity to share any updates you have and any thoughts you have on what topics you'd like to see this committee discuss in the next year. So with that, we'll start with Joe from CDOT.
No, nothing at this point. The only thing I may add for 2021 is that we're close to actually procuring a contract for support services for the Southwest Industrial Corridor. And so that's something that we're looking to do on an ongoing basis for the next several years. Whenever there's some hot button issues that need to be addressed, that contract will allow us to address them in a timely fashion. And the project limits would essentially be along the I-55 corridor, going essentially from where I-90-94 is to the east all the way down to the city border by Harlem. It's kind of jagged with the boundary there, so depending on what section you're talking about, it could be as far west as Harlem, but then also Central Avenue, but going north and south of I-55 as well with the communities there. So that's essentially looking at the current conditions of some of the network that we have there and then making improvements where needed. But that's just an overview of exactly what we're looking to do just in the general project limits there.
Great, thank you. So next we'll go to Elaine from Council of Mayors.
I think that these agenda topics look pretty comprehensive for 2021, and I think I don't really have anything else to add. And in terms of possible updates, I know we have some things going on in Will County, but I'm going to let Colin steal the show on that when it's his turn to talk. So
great, thanks, Elaine. So with that, Mike Burton, are you on? No, okay. So then we'll move on to Sam Wright with Cook County.
Yeah, so I mean, I think these agenda topics look great for us. Obviously, we have topics on there to discuss. Where thanks to Ryan to pushing back the bags in the BMC to 2021. Yeah, we're waiting on. Hopefully, we'll soon have IDOT's acceptance of the bags engineering agreement. So hopefully we can kick that off and then give a presentation at the same time, giving updates on our work with BMC, obviously all with the Village of Burnham. So, but rounding out the other topics, it looks great and very comprehensive to us. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Sam. And I just apologize to everybody. I have some truck noise in the background, so I apologize if it's hard to hear me. But next we'll move on to Colin with Will County.
There you go. For the work plan, an item that probably should be thought about every once in a while is LTA updates, like you did last month on the Will County mobility plan in the western half of the county. And what I sent out in the chat is a link for a smaller study in the eastern part of Will County, which is the Moni, University Park, and Crete locations. And they're in the data gathering process right now. And if you're familiar with that area, they would love for you to take a survey. So the link is provided. And so that's what the update that Elaine was referring to is our Eastern Will County freight mobility study. And that'll be all.
Great, thanks, Colin. So next it will be Eric with Illinois Trucking Association.
I mean, as far as adding to this list, I don't know how much I have. What I would like to say, though, and what I really appreciate as part of this conversation going forward, especially in the next year, the talk on climate agenda and the electrification of Class A commercial vehicles. Really looking forward to delving more into that topic, because I know that's one thing that we had talked about, Ryan, a little bit in our pre-meeting, that's kind of been really taken a focal point within the trucking industry, is this potential electrification. And, you know, I'm not even sure how much incentive these companies are going to need to make the switch, just based off the claims that we've seen from some Class 8 truck manufacturers that are currently in the works of developing and producing electric vehicles. So really interested to see where that goes. And so to keep that at the forefront this year for our as part of our work plan.
Great, thanks, Eric. Next is Clark Carricker from Illinois Chamber.
Hi, Ryan. So I concur with everybody else that the list looks fantastic. I think it kind of captures all the main points. Although I will say that at the Illinois Chamber, one thing that we are very concerned about is the next capital bill, and not going a decade plus without the kind of vital infrastructure investment that we need here in Illinois. And if we're going to do that before a decade, we need to, believe it or not, already start talking about what that looks like, and particularly the funding models. And so that would be something that we are very interested in starting the discussion on in 2021.
Great, thank you, Clark. Kazuya with UIC.
Yep. Yeah, I think this looks fine. In terms of the, information that we can provide as university research bodies, that we have been working on several railroad crossing studies, and one of them is to look at the non-physical measures to reduce the delays experienced at the railroad crossings, and mostly through the dissemination of the information to the motorists. And I will share material with you, Ryan, to see if that is suitable to be presented at this committee at some point or not.
That would be great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, Michael from FHWA.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. You highlighted a lot of the federal important dates, obviously, and we don't need to reiterate those. I guess just kind of, as always, Cmap has your ear to the ground for COVID, phase 4 bill. Be aware of that. And again, we'll get a full federal update. But one of the things, as everyone was going through, I was thinking of in terms of freight. I know Cmap has a large push for planned environmental linkages in the department. And basically, Federal Highway, there are some projects that Cmap is working on in the region, especially grade separation projects for planned environmental linkages to take care of some of those rail and road issues. Create has a few of them, as well as down in Will County, and I know as well as in Cook. So maybe something involved in that for a short little presentation that the Freight Committee might be interested in.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Thank you. Next is Amy from Tollways.
I think this looks great. Maybe one thing that is of particular interest is innovations in connected and automated vehicles, particularly CV, if there are ways for us to push information out to our truckers about incidences, truck parking opportunities, conditions of the roadway, just trying to understand what those opportunities might be.
Excellent. Next, John with DuPage DOT.
Thanks, guys. Just a couple of things come to mind. We have done freight routing studies recently, probably just a reconnoiter on some of those things. What's happened with some of those truck routing studies. What's being successful, what is not successful, what additional help we need with local communities and corridors to make them successful. Another thing that we always talk about is coordination of support for build and infra grants. And so I'm not quite sure what's coming out this year, but it's always helpful for us to know who needs what, and what projects are kind of up next, so we can be supportive of those. Those are kind of my two things that I'd recommend.
Great, thank you. Next is Libby Ogar.
Yeah, I guess one of the things I thought that didn't show up on the list is looking at the management of curb space, particularly for e-commerce deliveries, which have really spiked during the pandemic. So the list looks great, and I'm sure it's really long, but if we could add that to it, I think that'd be a good thing to talk about as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Next is Adam with CDA.
Well, Libby, you took some of the words right out of my mouth there for sure. No doubt I would put in a plug to on the aviation side, which has perhaps more than ever shown how critical air cargo has been this last year. We amazingly are up right now on cargo activity year to date, which is really amazing considering that passenger flights with all that belly cargo has been down about 60 to 90% over the year. So that's really on the shoulders of the freighters and the cargo-only aircraft, including conversions of passenger airplanes to cargo airplanes at the airport. So it's been extremely busy. I think truck connectivity, congestion reduction are very important, but especially it's not just the critical supply chain that's coming through air cargo and all those emergency supplies, and of course, right on the heels of vaccine distribution being the next big story in motion right now. But it's also e-commerce. In addition to those incredible numbers, I think it's like doubled or something like that over the past year. The associated traffic has also been seen in e-commerce on aircraft as well, not just the integrators like UPS, DHL, FedEx, but Amazon has even tripled or even quadrupled, I think, lately, the number of flights that are coming through, and they can't have more capacity fast enough in terms of those trucks lining up now. So I think congestion, more connectivity, and opportunities to improve on the air side of freight are important. You know, I couldn't get away without giving a little plug on that end as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Adam.
Yeah.
Next is Deanna Smith from IDOT. Deanna, are you there? Okay, we'll move on to Herbert Smith.
The only item, Ryan, that I would add to the agenda could be potentially a joint of several committees with Cmap agenda item, which is for Gabe Klein, a former CDOT commissioner, who's part of the Biden Transportation Transition Committee. His insights would be, I think, very interesting to hear of the transition committee discussions, you know, and maybe this is for something in the spring or summer when he's had time to, you know, kind of report back of what items were discussed. And again, if he or others from the Chicagoland region play a role with the U.S. Department of Transportation through political appointments. And that's
Great,
all.
yeah. That would make for a really interesting topic. Okay, thank you. Next is Eric Varela.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, not many more comments on the work plan you have here already. It looks great. The only thing that just popped into my mind was if there's any interest on the committee getting an update from maybe like the CREATE partners on what the latest and greatest is with the CREATE program. They've been getting a lot of federal funding over the past couple of years, and hopefully that continues. So if there's interest there, maybe to get an update from the great friends to the committee. That's it.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Eric. And then finally, we have Peter Wolf.
Yeah, list looks really good. I don't have anything to add at this time, but thanks for asking.
Great, thank you. So is there anybody that I missed? Okay. Okay, if not, we can move on. So I obviously I can't guarantee that we'll have time for everything that's been proposed, but I will certainly do my best to ensure this committee's work plan continues to be full of an array of topics that reflects the diversity of the transportation modes within the region and that are timely and relevant. So if you do have any additional ideas that you'd like to share, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you, everybody, for reporting out and sharing your ideas. And with that, Eric, I'll hand it back over to you.
Great, thank you. Just the final note on the agenda, I wanted to go ahead and open up for public comments at this time. So if you're not part of the team here, but you're here as part of the public, and you have a comment, you can either type that in the chat box, I believe Ryan will read those out, or unmute yourself and speak now.
Hi, it's Garland Armstrong. Happy holidays to y'all.
Hey, Garland, how are you, buddy?
All right. Just wanted to make sure, especially like, you know, for people with disabilities who don't understand about the trucking, we need to make sure that how will they make sure that whenever the trucks come into the residential area, especially for people with disabilities, how to make sure that they are well aware and what they need to watch out for, and then how to make sure to communicate, especially with the hard of hearing and the visually impaired, because there are sometimes, like, you know, when these truck drivers feel like they're in a rush, and then when a disabled person who has to cross the street area, here comes a trucking or something like that, and then all of a sudden their wheelchairs are going to be hit or broken, and then some of them who are in wheelchairs don't know what to do. So how to make sure that what we can communicate in the disability community to make sure that the trucking areas will be coming in the areas of it, so we can make sure that they'll be extremely well prepared for it. And how about having the trucking industry talking to the disability organization to see how we can work it out together so that it'll be a smooth transition without all these, you know, left behind. And so how we're going to be able to do that in the years ahead, because sometimes the disability community feels like they're being left out and they're taking a risk at it, and they just feel like they want the disabled people to be dead or something. So we need to make sure that the trucking industry work out with the disability organization to see what kind we can do and make sure the policies is fair for them, especially communicate with hard of hearing and the visually impaired so that they really have no idea what is what.
All right.
If I could just add something real quick, I would just thank you for sharing that, Garland, and I think we're going to have some excellent opportunities for those kind of discussions. With Cmap, I mean, we currently have the safety action agenda that's being developed right now. We also have the transportation equity framework that's being developed, and we're working on putting together equitable engagement program to help try to bolster our stakeholder engagement around communities such as people who have disabilities. So I think it's a very timely topic, and I think we're going to have, this committee will have a lot of opportunities to discuss those types of issues.
All right, this is Heather Armstrong. My concern is about trucks, tractors, and buses and trains. I think they need to run on regular unleaded, and I think also too they need to be hybrid. Hello?
Yeah, great.
Gotcha, Heather.
Okay.
Is there anybody else that has public comments that they'd like to make at this time? All right, well, hearing none, I just want to go ahead and remind everybody that our next committee meeting will be February 22nd, 2021 at 10 a.m. I want to wish everybody a safe and happy holidays, and hopefully our next meeting can be done in person and we can put some of the craziness of this year behind us. If there's anything that we can be doing for you, please don't hesitate to reach out to the committee. If there are things that we missed today or ideas you had that weren't mentioned. With that, we will adjourn and we will speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.